Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate all of you being here this morning. I always like to start by telling you why I'm here and why the Minneapolis Fed is here, because it's actually something that's unique in our country. So countries all around the world, free market countries at least, have a central bank. And the job of the central bank is to manage some of the ups and downs of the economy, so that if the economy looks like it's overheating, generally the central bank will raise interest rates to cool it down a little bit. Or if the economy looks like it's headed into a recession, oftentimes the central bank will cut interest rates to try to boost the economy and get more lending going. That's true in the US, that's true around the world. What's different in the US is that the US Congress 105 years ago said they don't want all of that power concentrated in Washington, D.C. They want to distribute that power around the country. So they created a distributed central bank. So there are folks in Washington, D.C. You've probably heard, way back when, you may have heard of Alan Greenspan, who was then succeeded by Ben Bernanke, who was succeeded by Janet Yellen. The current chairman of the Federal Reserve is Jay Powell. Those folks are appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the US Senate. But then we have 12 regional Federal Reserve banks scattered around the country, including the Minneapolis Fed, and our jobs are literally to represent you. So our jobs with Mishu, with Amy, my colleagues, are to get out around our district to understand what's happening in the local economy and bring this insight back to Washington, D.C. So I go back to Washington, D.C. every 6 weeks when we set interest rates for the country. And part of what I'm bringing to the table is telling them what's happening here in our region. So the region that I represent, that we represent, is Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and northwestern Wisconsin. It's a very diverse region. It's a large region. And so a lot of my time and our time are spent going around the region to say what's happening in the local community, what's happening in the job market, what's happening to wages, what are the different stresses in the economy. And then that feeds into our decision making and ultimately the recommendations that I make in Washington, D.C. for monetary policy. Now we do more than that. We also regulate banks. We do a lot of economic research. We process a lot of transactions. But maybe the core of our responsibility is the setting monetary policy. And so that's why I'm here. And I'd love to have a conversation, to hear from you what's happening in your community, what are the challenges that you and your neighbors and your families are facing, what's happening to your workforce, what's happening to wages. All of these things are very important as we try to assess, is the U.S. economy growing? How quickly is it growing? Is it overheating? Is it cooling off? All of your feedback can help make me smarter about that. And so I'm happy to answer your questions in our discussion, but I'd love it if you would also share with me what you're actually experiencing and what you're seeing with your own eyes.
All right, thank you so much. So I usually try not to ask questions myself, even though I have a few today. But I will let you guys get started. Again, I like his format, I like his styles, he likes to have a conversation, so why don't I just open it up and see if you guys have any questions. Let's make it a conversation. Now we have a microphone, so this session this morning is streamed live and through the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank. And we have a microphone just in case if you have any question. Chris will go around and give you a microphone.
If you have some, why don't you start to warm us up?
So I have a few, but I'm interested. One of the things that I really liked, so President Kashkari did write an op-ed sometimes in January about how important immigration is in this country, and I read it, and right after I read it, that was way back in January, and I said I think it would be nice for him to actually come over and talk a little bit about that. Then the very first person that I reached out to was Michu. So I sat down and they said, okay, we talk a little bit about that op-ed. So I like how President Kashkari talked about immigrations and why immigration is the key. It's so important into economic growth for this country. And we talk about the differences between the productivities and stuff. So I would like for him to make a little comment about with all the some of the challenges the immigration has been going down. So I just want him to make a little comment here about that.
Sure.
Op-ed, if you don't mind.
No, happy to
Please,
do it.
if you-
If you look at where does economic growth come from, it comes from two sources. One source is productivity growth, and that means workers have more skills and can produce more for the same number of workers. And that comes from technology development, better tools, it comes from better education. So that's one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is simply population growth. A growing population means you have more workers to produce things and you have more consumers to buy things, whether it's homes or cars or food. Well, in virtually all advanced economies around the world, the fertility rates have been going down as the countries have gotten wealthier. Our birth rates have just simply gone down. We're having fewer kids. And that means you really have three choices. If you're having fewer kids, you've got three choices. Number one is you can simply accept slower growth. Number two, you can try to do what Japan is trying to do, and you can try to give incentives for families to have more kids, like tax credits and free childcare. It's very expensive, and it takes 20 years. If it does work, it takes 20 years before you produce an able-bodied worker, so it's not fast. Or number three, you can embrace immigration. Those are your three choices, and this is just math. Slow growth, spend a lot of money to subsidize fertility, or embrace immigration. That's it. There's no other possible solution between those three. And so in my op-ed that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal, I just laid out the economic argument saying if we want a high growth US economy, and I do, immigration is going to have to be part of that, an important part of that. And by the way, as imperfect as we are, we're not perfect at it, we're better at it than anybody else. And so this is a huge competitive advantage that the US has because the US has done a good job over a long period of time welcoming immigrants, assimilating them, integrating them into the workforce. And so, full disclosure, my parents were immigrants from India. My wife is an immigrant. I've seen immigrant. I feel like I'm the product of this engine of assimilating immigrants and giving them opportunity. And I'll also just say personally, the fact that I, as a son of immigrants, am able to achieve the kind of role that I've achieved, speaks very well to our country, that our country does give immigrants a chance to prove themselves and to contribute. And so I think immigration is a huge competitive strength for the U.S. that we could take better advantage of.
All right. Thank you so much.
And by the way, I go around the whole district and I say the same thing. I don't tell one audience one thing and another audience another thing. And one time I've given the exact same, I said three choices: accept slower growth, spend money to subsidize fertility, or embrace immigration. Those are your choices. One time, somebody said to me, slow growth sounds pretty good. Usually, the vast majority of times people hear that, they understand it, and they say, wow, okay, I guess we need to think about things differently.
All right, any other question before I...
This gentleman has there's a microphone.
I'm sorry. Given that, and given that most business people would want faster growth, it's my impression that we hear very little from the business sector in favor of immigration and opposition, if you will, to the opponents of immigration or the efforts to tamp it down. That very much in the news these days. Is that perception accurate? And if so, why is there hesitancy, if there is, for greater advocacy in the business sector?
I think there has been a lot of advocacy, but it gets drowned out by some of the louder political voices. So for a long time, I know there have been two main business groups that have been taking on immigration. One has been the high-tech community that says we need more engineers and more scientists, and we bring people to the University of Minnesota, they get a master's degree or they get a PhD, and then we send them away. I think almost anybody can look at that and say that's crazy. If we're going to educate them here, we should support them to stay here. So I think the tech community has been very vocal on that for a long time. And then the ag community has also been very vocal, saying that they need workers to help work farms all across America. I heard that in California. I hear that in our region here as well. So I think there are business groups that have been focused on this for a long time. I don't know if they have been well coordinated. I don't know if they've had, it may well be that the tech community doesn't really care about farm workers. And it may well be that the farmers don't really care about the engineers. So I don't know how well coordinated they've been, but there are groups that have been talking about it for a while.
So with immigration being so important, so the current decline, as Nasibu spoke of earlier, do you think, and of course this is just your opinion, do you think it's going to impact the amount of people that we get overall, or is this just a small dip in the grand scheme of things, it shouldn't be too much of an impact?
The honest answer is I don't know. I mean, I think, this is, now I'm playing social scientist a little bit. You look at our country's history, it's a very long, successful history of immigration, feeding our country. It strikes me that that's probably woven into our DNA, and that there will be minor ups and downs, on the journey, but my guess is that it's going to continue to be a very important competitive strength. I mean, this morning I saw there was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal about Japan saying, okay, so culture matters here. So Japanese culture has been very resistant to immigration. They really want to preserve their Japanese culture. But even they're looking at the math and saying, well, this slow growth this is not leading to a good economic outcome. And so I like to say, in the end of the day, math wins. You can have all the beliefs you want, but at the end of the day, math wins. And I don't think the U.S. as a country is ready to embrace a slow growth future. So in the end of the day, I think immigration is going to be an important part of the U.S. economy, but there will be ups and downs on that path. That's just my opinion.
With the rising rate environment we're in, there's two trains of thought. One side wants and what we're seeing is the 0.25% increase. The other train of thought is let's just get over with and do 1%, 1.5% bump. What is your philosophy on that? And I say that because I know some higher ups in U.S. Bank have thought that way. Let's just do a larger rate increase. Are you of the mindset that 0.25% at a time is the right way to do it?
I'll just say I don't know anybody at the Federal Reserve who's been talking about a big 1% increase.
It was I know when we started raising rates was 2 years now. Richard Davis was some of the people higher up were the ones that were saying we need to increase rates, and the people under him were talking about a larger. Yeah. What is the philosophy with the 0.25% a couple times?
Well, I think it's what we've been doing is a gradual path to allow the economy to continue to strengthen. So right now we have, getting into monetary policy a little bit, we have what's called a dual mandate. We've got two goals that we're trying to achieve at the same time, on average over time. One goal is maximum employment, and that means as many people who want to work are able to find jobs. The other goal is stable prices, so an economy that's not overheating, but an economy that's not slowing down either. And usually we think these two goals are linked through wages. So when employers have to find workers, but they can't find workers, generally speaking, you expect them to raise wages to try to attract workers in. Well, they raise wages the way we think it works, that leads to then higher prices for the employer, and then they pass those costs on to consumers. So we typically think the job market and inflation are linked through wages. Well, what's happened over the last 6 or 8 years is the job market has gradually gotten stronger, which is good. Unemployment rate has come down, but wage growth has been very low, and inflation has been low. We would have expected higher wage growth and higher inflation as much as the job market has recovered. So we've been surprised by that. So what I think all of us have been saying is we don't want to prematurely end the economic expansion. We don't want to prematurely hold back wage growth. We want to achieve our goals over time. And so the debate that we've been having is how many increases. But that's why everybody has been saying, let's go on a gradual pace to allow the economy to continue to strengthen. Because, I don't know for sure, but if we went out and just raised rates by 1%, as you're suggesting, it would completely shock people. Right. And it would suggest, oh my God, it would send a very alarming message around the economy. Even that message could be enough to destabilize things and make people really nervous. So I think a gradual approach has been right. I've actually been on the opposite end, saying we should really slow down and really allow inflation to hit our 2% target, allow the job market to keep strengthening. I don't see any signs of overheating, so why are we tapping the brakes on the economy? But the good news is the debate is whether we do no hikes or gradual hikes. Thankfully, nobody that I know of is saying a big step up in interest rates. And then we'll go over here. No, go ahead.
Yeah, so good morning. Also an immigrant, and I also agree that we've done a great job as a country, I think, in terms of bringing immigrants and giving immigrants opportunities. It just seems to me lately that a lot of that immigration has become such a hot topic politically and emotionally, and a lot of the rhetoric seems to forget about the difference between legal and illegal immigration. It's just immigration, then people get all uptight. I'm just wondering, to what extent does that make your job very difficult to have a rational conversation about the need for immigration and the need for immigration to help us drive our economy? And do you think we'll ever get back to having rational conversations about that?
I think we will. Typically, I think historically the Federal Reserve and Federal Reserve officials have been reluctant to weigh in on immigration just because it is a charged topic. And so what I'm doing is I'm simply trying to talk about the economics of it. I'm not offering a moral judgment. You can make your own moral judgment. I'm simply laying out the math. And personally, I'm in favor of economic growth. If you have a solution for economic growth that doesn't include population growth, I'd be interested in hearing it. Because if you go to Japan for a second, their productivity and their economic growth is as good per capita as we are. They're actually quite a strong economy, but their workforce is shrinking. And so their overall economy is slowly declining. And so this notion, some people say, well, no, you just need productivity growth. Well, what happens if the productivity growth doesn't come? And we've had very low productivity growth for the last decade or so. And so, if you want a productivity-only growth strategy, I would invite you to look at Japan. And if you think that that's a good economic outcome for America, we'll just have to agree to disagree on that. So I agree with you on the political environment. I'm just laying an economic math argument. And that's the way I navigate it.
Thank you, President. Yeah, hi. Two questions. The first one is about the inflation in the housing market, and the rates are hiking. So for an immigrant population, I'm a mortgage banker, and we're seeing these last 2 years that a big segment of our population are being excluded from the market because of the rate hikes and because of the pricing hikes on the housing market. So what do you see going in the next few years in this market? The second question is, we are a post-industrial society. We're talking about growth. How are we going to grow if most of the things or segments of our society is already being satisfied, if I can answer that question that way? How many more cars can we sell to people? How many more homes can we build as quickly as possible? Where is the growth going to come from?
Well, so let me take these one at a time, and I may need to ask you to remind me the second one. The first question is about housing affordability. So you're right, interest rates do have an effect on housing affordability. But the bigger effect that we're seeing when I travel all around the region is just the affordable or unaffordable housing, or the affordable housing shortage that we seem to have all around our region. And by the way, this is true in right-leaning districts. This is true in left-leaning districts. It seems to be pervasive. So we're doing a lot of work at the Minneapolis Fed to try to understand what is the root cause of this affordable housing problem that we have. The best answer that we have so far is that we have all gotten very good at layering on lots and lots and lots of well-intentioned regulations to minimum requirements on the homes that we build. And safety is important, but lots of other regulations, all of which drives up the cost of housing. So I live in a community that has very large lot sizes. Other communities may say, you cannot build an apartment building here. We want to keep density low. California, for example, just passed a law that mandates solar panels on every new home that you build. Well, when you come up with all of these good ideas and you layer them together, all of a sudden the minimum cost of a home, the solar panels could raise the cost of a home by $20,000. If you think that doesn't directly affect working families, you're kidding yourself. And when we each have these ideas and we layer them on top and top and top and top, all of a sudden you've just driven up the minimum cost of either an apartment or a condo or a home. that to me seems to be a much bigger factor than what effect interest rates are having. Because interest rates, they're higher than they were a year ago or 2 years ago, but in the arc of 30 years, they're still very, very low relative to most of our recent history. And so I think the local regulations is probably a much bigger driver of the lack of affordable housing than is the interest rate environment. Okay, remind me your second question?
The second question is about the growth.
Yeah.
Where are we planning in a post-industrial society like ours? Yeah.
Well, I don't, where does the growth come from? I mean, I don't think that there's going to be a shortage of demand, meaning we're all going to have homes, we're all going to have cars, and we're going to stop demanding stuff. We all have our desires, and so we all demand more, and especially as our society ages, we know that healthcare and caring for our elderly is simply going to take up a bigger and bigger and bigger share of our needs or our production and our economy. So we know aging is going to be a big driver of demand. And then there's things like better education. There are resources associated with that for more students. We need to educate all of our students. We need to make sure everybody has access to high quality education. Not everybody has to go to a 4-year college, but it seems like almost everybody needs to go to at least a 2-year college, some kind of a technical certificate. All of that takes resources as well. And so I'm not worried that there's going to be a lack of demand for goods and services in our society. The bigger challenge is how do we produce the wealth and the earnings that we need to meet all of that demand? And that's where productivity and the workforce comes in.
All right, can I?
Okay.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
And the first part of my question is, when you're going to these various communities, what factors go into your recommendation? I know we mentioned wages and housing. Just curious about the other factors. And also, does your recommendation only pertain to interest rates, or are there other kind of sectors that it influences as well?
Well, the core part of the job for the Federal Reserve, and where we meet every 6 weeks, is to set interest rates for the country. So what I do is, and I think each of us does this our own way, but we try to make an interest rate recommendation for the whole U.S. But it is somewhat informed by what's happening here locally. So we all look at data that the government produces for the whole United States, but I try to make sense of what that data is telling me, in part based on what I'm hearing as I travel around Minnesota and our region here. So I'm making a specific recommendation on how do we achieve these two goals: maximum employment and stable prices, and what interest rate will help us to balance those two and achieve those two. So I'll give you an example. The headline unemployment rate in America peaked at 10% in 2009 in the Great Recession. It has now fallen to 3.8%. So it's come a long way, and that's roughly the lowest unemployment rate in 20 years. But that unemployment rate only includes people who are actively looking for a job. If you gave up looking for a job, you're not counted in that number. So then we look at a lot of other measures to say how many people else might be out there who might be available to work if the conditions were right. And so, there was an article a couple days ago in the New York Times showing how people applying for disability is now coming down. Economists thought that once people went on disability, they were on forever, and that this trend of more and more Americans going on disability would continue. A very positive surprise has been that because the job market has gotten stronger and wages have slowly started picking up, you're now seeing people come back in and take those jobs who we didn't expect to. That's a good thing. So these are the things that I'm trying to ferret out. Are there still workers on the sidelines who might be able to work? What is the outlook for wages? Because if wages just take off, it'll be good in the short term for workers, but if that just leads to elevating prices in the economy, then their wage gains are going to be eaten up by those higher prices. And that's why we don't want to have a high inflation environment. That actually isn't good for anybody. Did I answer your question? Okay, thank you. Did you have
Let me pick back a little bit on that question, if you can comment on this before I transition and go to the another topic about tax reform, tax cuts, whatever. So at one point in time, you made a comment about that you guys' job is to make sure that we have a full employment in the country. So what needs to be done for us to get there? And you very strongly say that, I know we're at 3.8. You didn't mention the 3.8, but we are at a very low employment rate now, which is great for the country, but at the end of the day, we would like to be at the full employment, and that's one of the job responsibilities you guys have. So what do we need to really focus moving forward to figure out, to make sure that we actually go down from the 3.8 now to a full employment?
Well, this is what we're all focused on, and it's trying to pay attention to how many other folks outside of the job market might come back in. So there's another measure that we look at, which is called the unemployment rate is the percentage of people who are looking, who don't have jobs. The employment to population ratio is another measure, which is if you just add up all the people and what percentage of them actually have jobs. And you can cut it out by age cohorts, because as society ages, you're going to have more retirees and the employment to population ratio will go down. But if you just look at working age folks, so what the economists say prime working age, which is 25 to 55, the number of 25 to 55-year-olds who have jobs today is lower than it was in 2006. The employment to population ratio is still lower. That implies 1 million or more people maybe could be available to work if the conditions were right, or if the jobs were there, or if the skills were there. So we're trying to figure out how many of those might actually want a job. Now, there may be reasons they don't have jobs. So for example, we know that the opioid epidemic is all across the country. And so if people are hooked on drugs, that might be a reason why they're out of the job market. And that might be something different than 10 or 15 years ago. So we're trying to look at that. There could be skills mismatch, which means you were a construction worker in 2005 and you lost your job. Housing has not bounced back nearly to where it was. And so now your skills are not suited for the jobs that are available. That's another theory that has some plausibility to it. So we don't know how many of these are structural and how many of them can change over time, but we're looking for every signal we can to see, are we really at full employment, or is there still some ways to go?
Thank you.
All right, so my question actually kind of leads into this about employment and that's regarding like the skilled trades, the HVAC technicians, the
Sure.
plumbers. There's a shortage of the workers across the country, and they're good paying jobs. And so how do we communicate, or what are your thoughts on like how we get people to go into these positions? Because prices will go up if there's less HVAC technicians
Sure.
to fix the furnaces.
I think you're absolutely right. I'll give you an example. I was recently in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I was visiting businesses and whatnot, and I visited a community college, and the president of the community college was giving me a tour, and I said, hey, while I have you, you need to train more welders, because everywhere I go, they say, we can't find trained welders. She said, I know. We tried. We spent a lot of money and doubled the size of our welding program, facilities and equipment, and we didn't get any more students. And so it's partly cultural, which is we've sent a message that certain jobs are not sexy jobs, or they're not high prestige jobs, and you shouldn't want to do these jobs. And the fact of the matter is they're very good jobs, and they do pay very well, and they are serving an important role in our society, in our community. So I'm with you 100%. So one part is culturally we need to change the way we talk about jobs and not send a message that every student needs to go to a 4-year college, and if you don't go to a 4-year college, you're not valuable. And then second, the price needs to go up. I mean, the price is an amazing thing. When wages go up, people say, wow, I could make X. You know what, I'm going to go do that. And so the price needs to respond, and we all need to pay more for our plumbers and our air conditioner repairmen and women, et cetera. And then I think the market will work. A little example that I use is people say, well, you can't get workers to move. And I point them to North Dakota in the oil boom of 2012, 2013, 2014. Workers flocked to North Dakota from all around the country. And by the way, working on an oil rig is not trivial, right? That is hard work, in many cases dirty work. People are willing to do it if the wages are attractive enough. People respond to prices, and so I think the price of our plumbers need to go up to attract more folks into that profession, and then they will.
And advertise maybe.
And advertise, absolutely.
You can earn whatever.
But I'll say, I'm with you 100%, but I'll also say, most people will say, like a lot of you were nodding your heads when I said, not every kid needs to go to a 4-year college. You know, technical schools are important avenues too. Most people nod their heads when I say that. But then if I say, how many of you want that for your child? It's very few. So, I mean, confronting this cultural challenge is not trivial. It's easy to say it, but it's not easy to actually do it in practice.
So I have a follow-up question about the housing, kind of the housing affordability issue. So, I certainly think that these layered regulations are an issue, but just with the price increases that people are seeing, I just think that that can only be a portion of this. And so, you know, kind of my question is, and I know the Federal Reserve is more on the policy side. Do you have any thoughts or ideas from a policy? I mean, so it seems to me the policies got us where we're at from the, with the home ownership disparities, say in Minnesota, and the, how many white folks own homes and non-white folks own homes, and the policies have gotten us here. And now we're in a spot where the CFPB is, being, changing. They're looking at changing CRA. And so all of these changes are not going to help make more homes affordable for a lot of folks. And so, my concern is that, you can look at some of these like layered regulatory issues, but that's not really going to get to the heart of the problem. And so I'm wondering from kind of the policy standpoint, and I know the Federal Reserve only plays a part of all that policy standpoint, but just your thoughts on that.
Sure. No, I actually, I didn't explain it well. The question that I'm asking is, you've got families who have jobs, they make a decent living, they could afford something, but why isn't supply coming in? Why aren't greedy developers, and I say that I don't mean to be disparaging, why aren't greedy developers saying, there's a great money-making opportunity for me to go build a house or an apartment complex to meet the needs of these families who have jobs? That's the question that I'm asking, and that's why I go back to the regulation, because my humble opinion is, you can go to the state legislature and ask them for another $100 million to subsidize affordable housing, and it'll be like a grain of sand on the beach. You will never, ever, ever keep up with the needs across our society if you think you're just going to, if we keep driving up the minimum cost of a house, and that means the checks from the legislature need to get bigger and bigger and bigger per unit, you're never going to catch up. So a little anecdote, I was in Duluth recently visiting a company, and one of the senior managers just moved there from Houston. Big city. Typically, you think big cities are more expensive than small cities. He said that housing in Duluth was much higher than housing in Houston. How can that possibly be? Well, Houston is notorious for lax zoning. Now, I'm not advocating that we want to turn every city in Minnesota into Houston, but there's something here about barriers to new supply coming in, and that's what drives up costs for everybody. So even if you built more homes in well-to-do neighborhoods in the suburbs, and you added a lot more nice homes in the suburbs, that is actually adding more supply to the Twin Cities region. And that could have an effect on price. And so there's another, I'm going to get the anecdote wrong. I read an article about Seattle that said rents in Seattle are now finally going down, even though Seattle is a booming city. According to the article, Seattle has built something like, they've built more units in the last 10 years than in the prior 50 years. You add a lot more supply, it has an effect on price. And so that's why I think I'm with you on a lot of the other regulations that you talked about that have an important role to play. But the root cause of this, in my opinion, are barriers to new supply coming in. Because again, somebody could make money building homes for working families. And why aren't they doing that?
So I guess I have a follow-up question then.
Let the mic come to you.
So my follow-up question then is, I from a mathematical standpoint, I agree. But let's say you build all these homes in the suburbs. I still think the challenge you face is there are many families that's not where they can or want to live, maybe from a transportation standpoint. So I work mostly in St. Paul and Minneapolis and do home ownership work. And I know that a lot of folks want to stay in the communities that they are. And the communities so our office is in the Frogtown neighborhood of St. Paul. And there are folks that rent there now that can now not afford to buy there anymore. And so I guess it's kind of the larger gentrification question. That supply won't resolve the issue for where people will be very limited in choice if that's the resolution.
No,
would be
I'm
my
not.
concern.
By the way, I'm not suggesting only building homes in the suburbs. I'm also saying build homes where you're working, or build homes in the neighborhoods that people want to live at. And why aren't they? I mean, if people want to live in that neighborhood, I'm just curious, what are the barriers from someone and going and building an apartment building there?
So I think, the challenge that we face is people are doing that, but what they produce is unaffordable at this point. So those price points are just so high at this point, and I know that that's happening in other major metropolitan areas. And so that's kind of why I get back to, like, how could that be? Because I agree with you. You add $100 million a year, that's just a drop in the bucket. But from a policy standpoint, is there a way in which we can do more to have to make that affordable for folks? Because right now they are building in Frogtown, but people can't buy there.
Well, again, I don't have a solution other than looking at what are all the barriers. So if you did all of the above and you unlocked the building in the suburbs, and then you unlocked building there and building, in all areas of the city where people live, where people want to live, that's the only solution I can think of. I mean, I don't see any other solution other than you going to the legislature and saying we need ever bigger and bigger and bigger checks to subsidize this, which again, as we both agree, is never going to keep up with the demand. But I appreciate your comments and your question.
Hi, I just have a follow-up question with employment. So we all know with the improvement in technology and basically the job market, eventually, from what I'm realizing, there's going to be less jobs and more demands for jobs with robotics and all that. So I just want to hear from your standpoint, what's the plan? How far are we from that, and what's the plan when we do get to that for people to actually have a good life?
I don't believe that. So a lot of Silicon Valley luminaries like to make these preposterous statements, and I don't believe it for a second. They said that when industrialization and automation was brought to farms, and all of a sudden they said, what's going to happen to all these workers? They were all picking fruit and picking vegetables, and now machines do it. Well, they moved to factories. So the nature of work has always been changing throughout human society and human history. It will likely continue to change, and it will be disruptive, and it'll be hard on individuals whose skills maybe no longer are needed. But the idea that we're going to run out of work, so far there's no evidence of that. I mean, I remember, when I was in engineering school, artificial intelligence was right around the corner. Right? There's a joke about cold fusion. So fusion, the thing that powers the sun, if you could do it on a desktop, you'd have free energy. They say that cold fusion has been around the corner. It's been 20 years away for the past 50 years. The same thing is true for artificial intelligence. And I always ask people, I say, I don't know, I shop on Amazon. Anybody else shop on Amazon? Has Amazon ever recommended something to you that wasn't blindingly obvious? I bought a book on George Washington, and Amazon and its brilliant artificial intelligence algorithm said, oh, you might like this book on John Adams. Really? That's the state of artificial intelligence today? Or Netflix. Netflix has yet to recommend a movie to me that was also not blindingly obvious. So I do think automation is coming in some things. So self-driving cars and trucks, I'm guessing it's further away than some of the proponents suggest. But is it likely going to come? Yes, it's likely going to come. Is the nature of being a truck driver going to change? Undoubtedly. But are we all of a sudden going to be out of work, out of the need for labor? I don't believe it. I just haven't seen any evidence of it.
But then there's going to be a shortage definitely in the job, because we think about businesses, they're all trying to reduce costs, improve profits, and I see it wherever I go with just the restaurants.
Sure.
Now there's a decrease in waiters or people attending to is all automated. So then obviously there's going to be a shortage. So I'm thinking, is there going to be some subsidy? I know some countries are trying that out where they give.
Yeah, but I guess
allowances.
I know you're talking about universal basic income. I'm disputing the notion that there's going to be a shortage. So you're saying you go around and you see fewer waiter and waitress jobs, and there's more automation, and I see kiosks at McDonald's where you can enter the order, and yet we have allegedly 3.8% unemployment. So the folks that had been flipping burgers at McDonald's are now doing something else. So already we're seeing the nature of the jobs is changing. And in part, they're turning to automation because they cannot find as many workers at the low wages that they're used to paying. So, I mean, we'll see. And if it really is The other example, have you ever seen the Terminator movie? Right? So the first Terminator movie came out in 1983, roughly. And the computer system that took over the world, called Skynet, was supposed to become self-aware in 1997, right? That was 20 years ago. We're no closer to Skynet than we were back in 1983. So when some of these folks make these very scary doomsday predictions, I take it with a grain of salt. People have been predicting that the world would run out of food. Malthus is this famous philosopher, said the world would run out of food centuries ago. And then we go and we've got 6 or 7 billion people in the world now, and we produce plenty of food. The food production is not the hard part. It's getting it to where it's needed is the harder part. So anyway, but you're right. Some countries are experimenting with universal basic incomes. I'm very skeptical of those because I think that psychologically we need to work. I think if you just live on handouts, that it is soul destroying. And you see it I travel to a lot of Native American reservations, and the tribal leaders will often say to me, I'm not saying this to them, they're saying it to me, we need to do something about the culture of dependence. And it gets passed down from generation to generation, and then it becomes a very hard cycle to break. So I worry about things like universal basic income in what it can mean for people who do not then enter the workforce, get educated, and have some purpose of providing for themselves and their families.
So about getting educated, we have noticed that there is a curb down in first home buyer purchases and things like that. The concern at this time is that the new graduates are heavily in debt. So what's your thoughts about that?
No, it's a huge issue. I totally agree. The need for education, the importance of education is only increasing over time, and it's only going to become more important. So we have to find scalable ways of educating more people, high quality education, without just layering more and more and more debt onto them. It cannot simply be driving up the cost and driving up the cost. So I don't have a magic answer, right? I haven't identified one answer. It's going to be probably going to be a combination of things from different delivery models. Certain courses that are being put online are having some success doing that and driving down the cost, reaching more students. That's not for every student. That's not for every course. But I think we're going to have to experiment on our different delivery models to reach more students at lower cost, because education is just going to become more important, and it cannot just be saddling everybody with more and more student debt. That's not an answer. It's not a sustainable answer.
All right. So we have until about exactly 9, unless President Kashkari wants to give you a couple more minutes, but we will end at exactly 9.
I'll need to run it 9.
So I'll let you go ahead and ask your question, then I'll move to tax.
Working off of that, some pundit recently suggested that instead of the tax cuts that were passed as a stimulus to the economy, that eliminating all of the accumulated student debt would have had as good or better an effect. And that, I think, leads into something you were going to ask about. Could you comment about that generally?
Well, so let me first say there's a bright distinction between monetary policy, which is setting interest rates up and down to try to manage the cycles of the economy. That's what Congress has delegated to the Federal Reserve. And then there's fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is when Congress and the executive branch decide how much they want to tax us and what to spend that money on, whether to spend it on education or defense or healthcare or roads, et cetera. So that's the purview of Congress through the political process to say how much should we tax people, should we tax corporations, should we tax individuals, and then what to spend that on. So that's purely the domain of Congress. I don't know, I had not heard that idea before of, I don't know what the economic effects would be if the tax cut money had then, instead of being used the way it was used to just pay off student debt. I mean, I think if you just think it through, those individuals that obviously have a lot less debt, they would have a higher propensity to spend, which that could be some boost to the economy. I think the proponents of the tax cut would argue they're incentivizing more investment, which could lead to greater productivity growth in the future. Is one, I don't know, I haven't thought about it, be able to analyze which one would have a better longer-term effect or not. I don't know.
Can I piggyback on that? So I'm a firm believer that the jobs will continue to be created by private institutions. And AEDC, one of the reason or main reason why we're in existence is really to just help to level the playing field. I really believe that at any one point in time whereby our community will be able to access reasonable capital, then AEDC should not be in existence. And again, I believe that this could be an opportunity for heading to the tax cut here. I think this could be an opportunity for the state to probably do our own tax. I know Minnesota is one of the very few states that mirror the Fed tax. So I know they've been talking about the tax conformity. It's been a huge discussion. I really believe maybe this could be, Minnesota is one of maybe 5 states that actually mirror the Fed tax exactly the way it is. So what do you hear in the business world, in the small business community, in the region and in the country about the tax cuts and the tax cut, tax reform?
Mostly, so I had not heard this, what you said about mirroring. I need to learn more about it. Mostly, I've heard people being optimistic. I mean, more optimistic than I had expected in the wake of the tax cut, saying that they feel like this is going to lead to stronger growth. But then I ask them, I say, is this actually leading you to invest more? And usually the answer is, well, not yet. We want to see how things go. So I think it's maybe still too soon to see what long-term effect the tax. We know what long-term effect the tax cut's going to have. We know if you cut taxes, on the margin that should boost economic growth in the short term, because simply you're putting more money in the pockets of workers or businesses, and they're going to spend at least some of it. They're not going to save 100% of it. So in the short term it's going to lead to at least a little bit of economic growth. The question is, when that short term is over, does it actually lead to longer term, higher, sustained economic growth? And that's unclear right now. So that's why I'm asking businesses, are you actually investing more? And so far the answer is, that I've heard, is we're waiting to see. Well, let me think. Oh, we've got one more, and then we'll.
Just a quick one.
Sure.
Met with a business last week. They have about 100 employees, roughly $5 million in revenue. And I asked them, what keeps you up at night? What do you see in the future that is going to be detrimental to your business? And I mean, you could tell he's been thinking about this a lot, but it was the minimum wage. And not just the $15, and how that would affect them, but the people that have been there for a while. So if you're giving someone new coming in $15 and somebody's been there for 3 years, now you have to increase, his thought process, increase their wages now. So it was that part of it, and he doesn't know how he's going to survive that if it does come. Do you run into that a lot, and what's the answer?
Well, first of all, we at the Minneapolis Fed have been selected by the city of Minneapolis to do a long-term study on the effects of the minimum wage increase. Does it end up being good for workers? Does it end up being, some people argue, there have been some studies that say worker hours get cut. So it may not actually be net positive. So we don't know. We want to do the analysis and see. But the example you gave is part of a broader discussion on why firms are so reluctant to raise wages. As I said, we would have thought there would have been stronger wage growth at this point in the economic recovery. Some businesses say, well, yeah, but if I pay more to recruit this worker that I need, then I got to pay everybody else more too. And they don't want to do that. And I say, well, then you're not that serious. Businesses love to say, we've got shortages. It's this historic worker shortage. Show me the money, right? Show it in the price that you're willing to pay. Then I'm gonna know you're serious. And so, I mean, I'm not disputing what the gentleman is saying. Not all businesses will be able to afford a higher minimum wage or can afford higher wages. But from my perspective as a monetary policymaker, I'm looking at the U.S. economy as a whole. Are we really at maximum employment? Until I start to see that wage growth pick up, I don't think we are. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you all having me. I appreciate you inviting me in, and I really enjoyed our discussion. So thank you for coming up this morning.